Bună seara. Good evening. Tonight's event is a special one. The author of the book we are talking about is with us, Mrs. Brigitte Battat, alias Mary Smith, the name on the book. Her family members are also here. Adina Battat and Jacob Battat. Welcome and thank you for coming here. The idea of this event belongs to the writer Adina Rosenkranz-Herșcovici. It's a good friend of our institute. She has this wonderful idea to present her friend from childhood. Adina is a writer here in Israel. She is a poet. She translates from French. She published interesting book, very touching book about her father Dadu, and she is a friend of Romanian Cultural Institute. Of course, you are wondering what the relationship is with Romanian culture, because the Romanian Cultural Institute aims and promotes the promotion of Romanian culture abroad, of course. One important writer of Romania, Octavian Paler, said, "The culture is the invisible army of a nation." Very nice and very touching. The author has Romanian roots. The chapter dedicated to Romania includes some cultural references important regarding Romania. Before the author speaks, her daughter and son want to express themselves. Please, Daddy.
Thank you very much. ערב טוב לכולם, תודה רבה שבאתם. יש לי כמה מילים באנגלית, ולאחרי זה יעקב האחי הוא יכול לדבר משהו בעברית יותר טוב ממני. So I will give a small background. The first time I read this book, it was 1 week after her husband, my father, passed away. The point is not to talk about that event, but to say that this is a time when the dynamics in the family change, and it is the time that I understood my mother really for the first time, not as my mother, Debbie, but as a human being in her own right, with her own dreams and her own wishes and her own life, completely independent from me. So this book was an opportunity for me to know my mother in a way that I had never known before. And when you see your mother or your parents in this way, when you really know your life, you do look at them in a different way. So I'm very proud of her and very pleased that we can be here. I know how important it is for my mother, and I hope that you enjoy the evening. Thank you. I will now hand it over to my brother, Jacob.
אני יעקב הבן של בריג'יט. רציתי לדבר קצת, יש קטע בספר מקודש לטיול משפחתי שעשינו כשהייתי בן 9 במערב ארצות הברית. וזה הטיול הראשון שיש לי בזיכרון, יש לי זיכרון ברור ממנו. עד כדי כך הצלחתי להתייעץ עם אמא שלי לגבי המסלול, וכדי לסמן במפה בדיוק הדרך שנהגנו בנסיעה הזאת. אז עד הרגע הזה אני למדתי על כל דבר רק דרך תוכניות בטלוויזיה, או בכיתה, או בספרים, תמונות, אבל זה היה הפעם הראשונה שאני למדתי דרך התבוננות, כאילו לראות דברים שנמצאים במקום הטבעי שלהם, ולהעריך מה זה באמת מרחקים ארוכים, מה זה לנהוג שעות ושעות ולא לראות שום עיר, כן. וגם ראיתי בפעם הראשונה שלי מקומות כמו גרנד קניון, Monument Valley, Devil's Tower, Yellowstone National Park, ואני הבנתי באמצע, בעזרת מדריך, מה זה באמת, איזה תהליכים גיאולוגיים בונים אותם, ולהבין וללמוד מה התוצאות מהתהליכים האלה. אז באמת זה היה כאילו משהו שונה מכל דבר שלמדתי בחיים עד אז. הנסיעה הזאת נשארת איתי כל החיים כתבנית להתבוננות ולמידה על מקומות חדשים. עד היום עדיין יש לי הדחף לגלות מקומות חדשים דרך שעות ארוכות של נסיעה ולהעריך לראות בשממה והביראה ועוצמה של הטבע. זהו.
הבן שלי בעצם מדבר על טיול ראשון שאנחנו עשינו בארצות הברית. זה היה פשוט חלום. אנחנו הלכנו the wild west of America. But what they don't know is that once they left home, my husband and I became explorers of the entire North America. And I think the only place we didn't see was Hawaii, but otherwise we went to every corner. And here I'd like to say a few words in Hebrew. My Hebrew, העברית שלי ממש גוססת, אבל אני אנסה לדבר על זה. הספר שלי בעצם מדבר על שני דברים. דבר אחד זה מה זה להתרגל למקום חדש, מה זה לנסוע למקום חדש, למדינה חדשה, לעיר חדשה, אצטרה ואצטרה. מה התהליך ואיך מתרגלים למקום חדש. אבל הספר שלי גם כן מתאר את המקומות שהלכנו בתור משפחה לחודש שלם כמעט 20,000 קילומטר, ונסענו לכל פינה במערב הפרוע של ארצות הברית. ופה הייתי רוצה להגיד משהו. לפני כמה ימים ראיתי סרט, ואחת הדמויות אמרה משהו. היא נסעה לעיר קטנה במדינת אינדיאנה בארצות הברית. והיא אמרה ככה, היא נסעה עם כנפיים, אבל כשהיא הגיעה, היא הגדילה שורשים במקום הזה, בעיר הקטנה. וזה מה שאני ניסיתי לעשות בכל מקום איפה שאני נסעתי. זאת אומרת, אני ניסיתי לשים שורשים, לגדל שורשים בשבילי וגם בשביל המשפחה שלי. זה דבר אחד. דבר שני, אני תיארתי את הטיול שלנו במערב הפרוע, ואני לא ראיתי אותנו בתור תיירים אנחנו היינו אקספלורר. אנחנו ממש למדנו על המקומות האלה. למדנו על הגיאולוגיה, על המזג האוויר, על האנשים והטבע. ופה אני רוצה להזכיר את אדוארד אבי. אדוארד אבי היה שומר על ארצ'יס מונומנט, זה אחד הפארקים שביקרנו. הוא כתב ספר דזרט סוליטר, והתיאורים שלו הם ממש יפים. אני לא יכולה לכתוב ככה ואני מאוד מקנאה בו. אבל אני תרגמתי, הוא סופר אמריקאי, תרגמתי משפט אחד לעברית, בגלל שזה מאוד נגע בי. והוא אמר ככה, השפה יוצרת רשת רופפת אדירה, שבאמצעותה ניתן לדוק עובדות פשוטות, כאשר העובדות הן אינסופיות. זאת אומרת שהשפה היא מאוד מאוד חשובה. עכשיו אני הייתי רוצה להתחיל עם המצגת שלי. This book is dedicated to my beloved husband who died on September the 20th, 2020, and to my two children, all three, listened to the stories in this book. But most of all, I dedicate this book to my parents, who put the seeds of who I am today. The thirst for knowledge, for literature, for critical thinking. And here I would like to mention Dr. Charles Krauthammer. Dr. Charles Krauthammer was a psychiatrist, but he changed his career. He became a journalist, like my father. And I would say Dr. Charles Krauthammer and my father belonged to a category of extinct journalists. They don't make them this way anymore. Dr. Krauthammer died not long ago. He used to work for the Washington Post. And here, I would like to reproduce a paragraph from his book, which I highly recommend, Things That Matter. Politics, the crooked timber of our communal lives, dominates everything, because in the end, everything lives or dies by politics. You can have the most advanced and efflorescent of cultures. Get your politics wrong, however, and everything stands to be swept away. Politics is the moat, the walls beyond which lies the barbarians. And don't we witness it today? So, Mark Twain wrote, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness." And many of our people need it on this account. So, in essence, he says, all right, travel to places so that you get rid of bigotry. And I don't agree with him. As much as I love his writings, I really, Mark Twain is one of my favorites. I don't agree with him, because unless you go and you noshem the same, you have to breathe the same air, you eat the food of the locals, you laugh at their jokes, you understand their idioms, you really can't get rid of the bigotry. That's a fact. So, how did it all start? We traveled to the United States of America back in 1983, and I joined the Writers Club. They told me that they are going to write memoirs. So I told myself that's an absurd exercise in self-indulgence. I don't want to write about myself. Who am I? However, I believe what is one's role in life. One's role in life is to take care of the family, to be productive, to the society at large, and try to be happy, to be content in the process. Nevertheless, I like to write. So how did it all start? And I really have to mention how it all started. I remember the play called The Chairs by Eugene Ionesco, which I saw in Hebrew and in English in New York City. And it's an avant-garde play about an old couple who claims, both characters claim that they can save humanity because they suffered so much throughout their life that they can save humanity, they can teach how to avoid mistakes in life. And the other characters are chairs. That's why the play is called The Chairs. Each chair represents a character from their lives. And they talk about their interaction with all these people. At the end of the day, they say, yes, we suffered a lot and we can save the world. What happens at the end of the play? They die. And the feeble-looking character, a man, pale, appears on stage and tries to say a few words, but in the process he collapses. And my interpretation at the time was the pair, the two old people, did not manage to rescue humanity, the world. Why? We are not receptive to others' teachings. We prefer our own mistakes and experiences. Now, my write-up is not so much about me, not really. It's more about the places, how I interacted with it, and how much I really wanted to be part of mainstream society, because I wanted to succeed professionally and socially. All right.
You stay there, maybe, near your mother. Take the stay.
Yeah. Now, I was born in Romania and lived there for 17 years. And I would say that that period in my life can be divided into two phases. Pre and post 1958. What happened in 1958? My parents applied for exit visas. They declared that they wished to leave the country. So they became unemployable. And my translation was, they were traitors. Up to that point, we had a good life. My father was a journalist, my mother was a translator. My father's position was the main newspaper in Bucharest enabled us to frequent cultural events and special social events. And I was exposed to a lot. I was my parents' partner. I wasn't their daughter. I was an only child, but I was their partner. And truly, it was a very pleasant life. Not because we had a lot of money. Nobody had a lot of money there. But we had access to special events. So, I consider Romania as my home. Why? What is home? Home, it means friends, but loyal friends, community, family. And here I am in the middle, bossing the two children that I grew up with. I was an only child. Again, I was my parents' partner. And here we stand at the foot of the Palace Castle. and we had very stable relationships. I felt loved, and that's one of the reasons why I can consider Romania as home. So, all right, my father was a journalist, and we used to go regularly to gala performances, avant-premieres, new movies, especially at Censorship House. And this particular one stays with me in my memory. I was about 5 years old. I believe it was the first performance at the Opera House. It was Rusalka, and the story stays with me to this day. It was really beautiful. Excuse me, I have to do it. It is about a girl, the daughter of a miller, Natasha, who loves a prince. And the prince declares his love, eternal love. But he does what a prince is supposed to do. He marries a princess. And when Natasha discovers this, she commits suicide. She jumps into the river Dnieper. And there she becomes the queen of Rusalkas. One day the prince, who is now married to a princess, approaches the river. He goes hunting and approaches the river. The miller, Natasha's father, notices him, pushes him into the river, and the prince drowns. I was 5 years old. I didn't realize that he's dead. I didn't realize the ending was tragic, because everything was so beautiful, diaphanous. It really looked like an underwater world. So I loved it, and to this day I remember it. Another remarkable play, and this one is truly special. It's called The Dragon by Evgeny Schwartz. I don't know how many of you remember him. I think it was back in the 50s when I saw the play, and it made on me such an impact that with the first opportunity I bought the book in later years. And what is the book about? A small town, the population is ruled by bureaucrats with the help of a dragon. And the Knight Lancelot, the Knight Lancelot represents, is symbolic of fighting for freedom, for liberty. He comes to this town and is determined to free the population. So he tackles the dragon. He faces the dragon. And what does the dragon tell him? You see, the human soul is very resilient. Cut the body in half, and the man croaks, dies. But tear the soul apart, and it only becomes more pliable. That's all. No, really, you couldn't pick a finer assortment of souls anywhere. Only in my town. Souls with no hands. Souls with no legs, mute souls, deaf souls, chained souls, snitch souls, damned souls. What happens? Of course, Lancelot kills the dragon. But what happens to the people? Do they become free? No, they miss the dragon. So Lancelot returns and realizes that he failed to free the citizens. We have to kill the dragon in each one of them. Does it sound familiar? I think the dragon is now present throughout the world. Sorry to say. And other events, the Censorship House. My father, as I mentioned before, was a journalist, so we had access to unusual movies, foreign movies. And one of them remains with me to this day. It's about a little boy. The name of the movie is The Little Shoe Shining Boy, an Indian movie that depicts abject poverty in Bombay. He was not much older than me at the time, and I started crying, but everyone around me was an adult, so I surreptitiously wiped my tears. I didn't want to see the adults, and I'm only a vulnerable child. So to this day again, I remember this event. And I had various invisible friends, quite a few. Schiller, right, Baron von Münchhausen, Beethoven, Pushkin. They came from various sources. And I remember Beethoven. Why? Because to this day, I love the Ode to Joy. I think everybody knows the Ode to Joy. One Sunday morning, I listened to the Ninth Symphony. I was a child. That's pre-1958. I fell in love with the Ode to Joy. Later, when I was in high school, I learned that the original title had been Ode to Liberty, but Beethoven was forced to change the title. He was in an area, an occupied area. He was not allowed to use such terminology. Anyway, so I would try to reproduce something here written by Paul Becker. The sum of his message was freedom, artistic freedom, political freedom, personal freedom of will, of art, of faith, freedom of the individual in all aspects of life. In my parents' bedroom, I was conducting famous world orchestras, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Another invisible friend of mine, Baron von Münchhausen, and I had many such invisible friends. And who was Baron von Münchhausen? Apparently a real character, somebody who lived, I believe, in 18th century Germany. He was a soldier, traveled throughout the world, Russia included, and wrote various stories. One is crazier than the other. And there is something quite unique about his stories. On the one hand, when you start reading it, it sounds valid, it sounds real. But as the time progresses, it becomes crazier and crazier. And this is one example. Baron von Münchhausen participated in a battle. His horse was very thirsty. He brought the horse to a place where he could drink. He could not understand why his horse is so thirsty. He looked back. Half of the body was missing. It had gone away. So, of course, he had many, many such stories. Another aspect of our life which I enjoyed was our vacations to the various locations in Romania, actually most of it to the Bucegi. And here I would like to reproduce one particular event. In 1954, my mother and I went to the mountains. We reached a resort near Sinaia. I believe it belonged to the government. And we were told the children are not allowed because of the polio epidemic. And the bureaucrats at that location organized for me a cubicle, a small room, in George Enescu's house on his estate. I would be there by myself, but two peasants who took care of the estate would also supervise me, and I must mention that they had children, and I had crazy fun with them. So in 1954, the tragedy of the polio epidemic became the catalyst to the best summer of my life. I was 6 years old without nagging parents. And here is a Georgian UNESCO estate, magnificent place, high up in the mountains, no memory of urban life, no roads, no four-wheeled vehicles, absolutely beautiful. And that's the inside. Of course, I didn't live here. I had a tiny, tiny room. And what I remember is that the estate had mostly string instruments. I didn't understand why his penchant for string instruments. I remember one or two pianos. And what happened there? One night I wanted my parents. Why? Because there was a major storm, lightning, thunder, branches swaying and producing shadows all over, and the isolation, and I was scared. So I wanted my parents, but as a whole it was an incredible trip. Another memorable excursion where I met the wolves, a pack of wolves in the Bucegi, and I will never forget them, with their yellow eyes in the night. In 1959, my school organized this trip, and for 2 weeks we were completely isolated in a cabin, and there the water would freeze in the pipes, so we would have to melt the snow to wash our faces and brush our teeth. But something else, we learned that winter that teachers are also human. Why? We witnessed how they danced, they joked, they even prepared a puppet show with old socks. And one of them was responsible with our safety. He had a gun, and that's how we moved from one cabin to another, because there were wolves in that area. In 1956, we learned about the Hungarian insurrection, and I don't know how many of you are acquainted with that event. It was very sad. The Russian tanks rolled into Budapest and many people died. The West was hearing from their free press that bodies were strewn in the streets. And we were all hoping that NATO would come to rescue the Magyars, but it didn't happen. And Hungary remained a Soviet satellite. When in the United States, I asked a colleague of mine why his government didn't intervene at the time, and his response was the US had tried to avoid an open conflict with the Soviet Union, which might have led to a nuclear disaster. However, during my American period, I realized that America really is quite insular, and people know very little about the world outside their borders. I may be wrong, but that was my impression. In 1958, my parents applied for visas, exit visas, and from that point on, we became commoners, whatever. And I call that period purgatorium. It lasted 6 years. So here I'm not going to say much. Yes, it was a very difficult period. My father became sick. He was very concerned about our situation. However, just before we left in 1964, before we even knew that the visa is about to arrive, my father and I had one more adventure. In the summer of 1964, my father and I traveled to the Central Carpathians and came to Herculane, on the banks of the river Cherna. And all I can think of was how beautiful that place. It was so beautiful. really instilling peace. And to this moment, I still remember it. However, here, I would like to reproduce a paragraph written by George Friedman. He is an American journalist and writer who sees the Romanian mountains not for their beauty, but for their geopolitical importance. And here it is. The Carpathian Mountains define Romania, but in an odd way. Rather than serving as a border of the country, protecting it, the Carpathians are an arc that divides the country into three parts. To the south of the mountains is the Wallachia Plain, the heart of contemporary Romania, where its capital, Bucharest, and its old oil center, Ploiești, are located. In the east of the Carpathians is the Moldavian Plain. To the northwest of the Carpathians is Transylvania, more rugged, hilly country. And this is the geopolitical tragedy of Romania. Romania is one nation divided by its geography. None of the three parts is easy to defend. And here is a picture from Herculane. It was raining the entire time, but we didn't care because we ate kataifi and baklavas, and we walked everywhere and we talked to everyone. We had a wonderful time. So we are about to become nomads. One day, my mother called us and ordered us to come home. Our visas had arrived. So we traveled to Bucharest in style. We traveled with a restaurant card for the first time in our lives, and my father talked to all the people around him. He was a very friendly individual. So we became nomads. How did it happen? We took a flight with Tarom from the airport in Bucharest. It was my first experience with seeing the world from above. My first glance at a diminutive world. We are flying over the Dolomites, announced the captain. It has over 2,000 caves, he continued to inform us. My mother was airsick. My father was really concerned about our future. We didn't even know where we are heading to. We were not sure yet. But all I could think of was the rugged summits, the snowed-up caps, the ridges, the dotted villages, the splendor of this planet. My first time on an aeroplane. This was Yugoslavia, a country which 3 decades later would cease to exist. In 1991, the media informed the world of the Civil War. I conjured up the images of an earlier time and thought that nothing seemed to inspire peace and tolerance, and even the splendor of the landscape. So, as far as I can see, history repeats itself. We landed in Naples, the capital of the Campania, and of course the sky was brighter than in Bucharest. For a starter, Naples is closer to the equator than Bucharest. And this was my first adventure. We traveled by bus, and suddenly I saw an incredible structure jutting into the sea. This was Castel dell'Ovo, the oldest standing fortification in Naples. Today I walked everywhere. We were in Naples for quite a few months, and this was my first exposure with the capitalist world. I saw beautiful clothes. I wanted everything but couldn't buy anything. I saw people beautifully dressed. I also saw very poor areas. And at night, I would look through the window and would see the lights of the harbor and the truncated form of the Vesuvius. During the day, I toured everywhere. I loved Naples and I loved Italy. There was something not only beautiful but warm, not only about the weather, but the people were like the weather, warm, friendly. And here is a royal palace exhibiting the statues of the Neapolitan kings, the last being Victor Emmanuel, who in 1848 was deposed by Garibaldi, by the revolutionary Garibaldi. Some books say 1860. I remember 1848. What else? On Sundays, I saw something totally novel. Girls in white dresses going for their communion, and also dolls the size of children being sold and being dressed up like these beautiful girls. And everything looked happy, families looked happy. So after a few months, we became nomads again. The next phase is Israel. We traveled from Naples to Rome, to the airport. The driver sang canzonetas and arias the entire time. He had a beautiful voice, and I asked him, why don't you make money being on stage? Go to opera in Milano. Of course, he didn't listen to me. So what happened? We reached Rome airport. We walked through the corridors, and finally we saw the El Al aeroplane beyond the glass wall. And what did I tell myself? This aeroplane was about to transport us to the promised land of milk and honey, of freedom and disappointments, and maybe of opportunities. El Al, after all, in Hebrew means towards heights. And we all forgot about our fears and apprehensions and enjoyed the view from above. Now here I would like to reproduce a sentence from George Orwell in Coming Up for Air. Why? Because I tried to follow his instructions. He wrote, the old life is finished, and to go about looking for it is just waste of time. You cannot put Yona back into the well. True, isn't it? So what did I do? Once I landed in Israel, I told myself, I'm an Israeli. I refused to look back, lest I would turn into a pillar of salt like Lot's wife. So I went to a kibbutz. After 3 months, I stopped saying, me not speak Hebrew, and I communicated with natives. I learned, I rather copied their manner. I really wanted to be part of the local society. And I repeated this experiment with each move of mine to another country. Throughout my peregrinations, I mentioned, I did exactly the same thing. And here I would like to mention the 6-Day War for 2 reasons. First of all, on the 5th of June 1967, I had to collect my father from the Bennington hospital. He was dying of cancer. The hospital was expecting wounded soldiers, so they vacated the sick people. But here I must mention, I feel obligated to mention a paragraph from a book called The True Believer by Erich Hofer. Erich Hofer was an American writer of German origin, and I truly recommend his book. His book talks about various minorities, not just, the focus is not on Jews. However, I would like to reproduce this particular paragraph because I have not seen anyone else writing so clearly, so concisely, like Erich Hofer. It is of interest that the Jews who submitted to extermination in Hitler's Europe fought recklessly when transferred to Palestine. And though it is said that they fought in Palestine because they had no choice, it is still true that their daring and reckless readiness for self-sacrifice sprang not from despair, but from their fervent preoccupation with the revival of an ancient land and an ancient people. They indeed fought and died for cities yet to be built and gardens yet to be planted. And I would say his book is unique. So to this day, I recall the 6-day war. My sojourns in England and America have been tinged with the bliss bordering with ennui. Life there has been much, much more peaceful. The British Isles, on December the 20th, 1973, at 6 a.m., I left Israel to pursue my graduate studies. I was, for the first time, on my own. I was taking an aeroplane on my own. And I was very proud of myself. And it was a very complicated process of learning how to be not so much a nomad, but try to settle down somewhere completely new. And why was it new? I had to learn about the money. I had to learn how to use public telephone. And I was gradually evolving. I was becoming an emancipated traveler, a citizen of the world. Me, the individual that had grown up in a very isolated country. And here, I remember Hilaire Belloc, a well-known poet, a British poet. If you were born to walk the ground, remain there, do not fool around. But I didn't listen to him. I fooled around big time. So initially, I stayed with a cousin of mine on the top floor of a 16th century estate that the government was renovating to turn into a cultural center. And this estate is, to this day, is located in a place called Waterloo Park in London, in Highgate. What's remarkable about Highgate? It's full of bookstores, some of them dating to Charles Dickens' period. And we also had a very famous neighbor, right next door, Karl Marx, immortalized. So what happened there? People at the weekend would walk their dogs through the Waterloo Park, and the dogs would urinate on the poor guy. A few weeks later, I moved to a tiny village, a historic village called Sherrington in Buckinghamshire. What's historic about it? It had a church going back to the Norman period, about 1,000 years old. But also it had a very famous road where Cromwell fought the royalists in 1642. And that's where it all happened. However, something even more important. That's the place where I had my first bicycle and learned to balance it, and all the neighbors came out. And this was really a tiny village. It had no food store. It only had a pub. So a few months later, 1974, I joined Cambridge University. And here is King's College Chapel. Yes, King's College Chapel, where I used to listen to the King's College Choir, magnificent music. And to this day, I believe it was the happiest time of my life. From all points of view, social, scientific, cultural, there were so many opportunities. I had colleagues from all the corners of the world, some from Tasmania, some from Hong Kong, from Lithuania, all over the world. It was unbelievable. And this is the river Cam, where we used to go hunting as a group. And what did we see at lunchtime from the windows of our canteen? Three-legged dogs. Apparently they were suffering of cancer, and they were patients at the University Veterinary Hospital. But also the place, Steve Hawking's place, the Center for Theoretical Cosmology, was not far from our lab. A few years later, I had a family, I had children, a husband. We moved to a town very close to Ayotte St. Lawrence, was George Bernard Shaw's estate. And we used to frequent his estate often. This is his library. The house was modest. He actually died in his library in 1950. What I remember from it is not only that there were photographs of various personalities that he met throughout his life, but the shaking of hands with Stalin.
Sure.
And I would like to mention also something else here. I really loved his writings. So when we lived in the United States, at the time very close to the border with Canada, we used to frequent the show festivals in the summer in Canada, in a place called Niagara-on-the-Lake. And my children, I hope, remember to this day. Because they had to suffer. They had to see Bernard Shaw plays. So here we are again, nomads. On the 20th of April, 1983, we landed in Boston. We actually were transferred with our jobs from England to the United States. And what happened when I arrived there? I wasn't by myself. I had the responsibility of children. And I was very concerned because I wanted to bring them up in the mold of my childhood days. I wanted them to have the knowledge that I grew up with. But also I was aware that they had to be able to function in America. So I tried to balance this. As for myself, I was determined to understand the country in all its facets, for I wished to be a member of this melting pot. And in the United States, I had incredible adventures from all points of view. Not only I traveled everywhere, by car and by train, and I really learned about the country, but I learned about the people. And let's make it quite clear, each state in America is practically another country. And it's not just the landscape that differs, also the people differ. So, on the 20th of April 1983, we took another plane from Boston to upstate New York. We flew for about 50 minutes. The plane started circling, ready to land, and my children did not believe that what they were seeing below was snow. because in their books, April was springtime, and you are not supposed to see snow in springtime. Okay, so now I would like to describe our trip as a family to the wild west of America. And this none of us forgets. I had many other trips such as this, but not with my children. And here is the route. My son actually identified all the places because I could not remember every spot. The route is marked in yellow. As mentioned before, I put on the car almost 20,000 kilometers. We were there for more than a month. And we became explorers. We were not really tourists. We were explorers. We were determined to learn about this part of the world. I came upon a book called Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. His descriptions are phenomenal. He actually was a ranger. He lived on Arches National Monument, and he wrote a book about that period. He says, wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit, and I truly agree with him. I love nature. I don't mind living in the remotest corner of Wyoming or Montana. So we landed in Denver, Colorado, and our first stop was Pikes Peak. Apparently that's the highest mountain in mainland United States. We attempted to drive to the top, and we all became sick because we had come from low level, sea level almost, to very high elevation. And here are my children waving to us from one of the rocks at the Garden of the Gods in Colorado. And I'm not going to mention here details, but the book describes why the color, why the formations are the way they are, the vegetation, etc., etc. So, Great Sand Dunes National Park, Colorado. Yes, that's Sahara Desert. It looks exactly like the Sahara Desert. And apparently, it has a collection of the highest dunes in North America. And here you can see a human being in this spot here in red, attempting to climb. We also attempted to climb in the summer, and temperatures actually reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The book has detailed description of how these dunes were formed, not so detailed, but I attempt to describe why these dunes were created and how. We also wanted to learn about the prospectors of the 19th century America. They were digging for gold. And so we took a narrow gauge train from Durango to Silverton. And these are the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. So there were many, many old mining camps. We reached Silverton, and it was a ghost town. And both Durango and Silverton, to this really epitomize the Wild West, a corner of this planet that the time had forgotten. And to be honest with you, we saw many such places throughout the West. The Mesa Verde, by the way, this presentation covers maybe 5% of all the places that we saw throughout the West. This is Mesa Verde, and what is special about it? That's where the Puebloan Indians used to live. They settled here and lived here for almost 900 years, from 450 to about 1,300. And this is sandstone. Their structures are made of sandstone. And all this area, it's actually the southwestern part of Colorado. It's littered with such settlements. They are called cliff dwellings. Navajo National Monument. It used to be inhabited by the Navajo Indians, but now the Navajo Indians live in a town not far from it in Arizona. And here are my two children baking in the sun of the National Monument. We were really the only people. We had to take a jeep in order to cross this area. You cannot drive it by car, it's all sand. And here you see many butte. What's a butte? It's a special structure. It looks monolithic, yes? But the width of the butte is actually bigger than its height. And the predominant color here is red, or various shades, because of hematite, the iron oxide. And here is the panoramic view, the mittens, and the road going all around. We followed this road, and if I remember correctly, here we saw engravings of the Navajo Indians from a very old, long time ago. And what is this? That's a movie, Stagecoach. I don't know if you know the movie. John Ford considered this area ideal for making his movies. He made cowboy movies. Why? Because it was such a remote area, so unspoiled. So here you are, John Wayne, I think, is on the left. And he used Navajo Indians for his characters that would represent the Apaches in the cowboy movies. Now, don't laugh, but this is a very special place. It is called the Four Corners, and it's unique in the world. And what's unique in this place? 4 states, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, meet in one place. And my son was determined to have each live in a different state. And here he is. So, all right, a writer called Ryden Casey argues that this is unique. Why? There is a long description. I'm not including everything here. The desire to simultaneously straddle the territory of 4 states is based on the notion that straddling the border provides an experience of being in more than one place at once. It is a unique feeling. We were heading for the Grand Canyons, and I've seen Grand Canyons a few times. But before I mention the Grand Canyon, I would like to say why we wanted to see the Grand Canyon as a family. First of all, it's an attraction for everyone. But there is something else. My children read a book called Brigitte of the Grand Canyon, apparently based on a real story. And what is so special about this story? An old prospector comes to the area to look for gold and befriends a burro. A burro is a donkey, a wild donkey, yes? His name is Brighty. They become friends. And here is what Margaret Henry writes. The prospector roped and gentled him, but then he gave him his freedom. Instead of hobbles or pickets, he held onto him by the invisible cord of friendship. After the prospector died, Brighty became a wild spirit again. What happened when we went to the Grand Canyon? We saw the burro. Burro came right in front of our car. and we had the pleasure of petting him. And my children were in heaven. Okay. And this is the cover of the book, Variety of the Grand Canyon. This is a picture taken with my very old camera going down the canyon. Now, one very important aspect is the difference in temperature. 20 degrees. The lower part, the bottom of the canyon is 20 degrees warmer. And as a result, there is no snow falling there. So, however, the vegetation and the wildlife, especially snakes, there are snakes there of all types, differ, top and bottom, not the same thing. Royal Gorge Bridge in Colorado was considered the highest suspension bridge in the world until 2001. That year, the Chinese built a higher bridge. The bridge crosses the gorge at 291 meters above the Arkansas River. And we walked this bridge. And when we looked down, we thought we were looking on planet Earth from the moon. At least we had that feeling. Salt Lake City, Utah. Here we visited the settlements established by the original pioneers moving west from the East Coast. We also went to a museum that had an incredible collection of fossils. However, the most remarkable event was the concert. 360 members of the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square, performing only twice a year. And we were fortunate to be able to listen to them. The Devil's Tower, I don't know how many of you have seen Steven Spielberg's movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I believe I know the last scene was filmed there. And some critic mentioned that this represents the fact that people should go into cosmos. This is, with my old camera, the entrance to the Devil's Tower. And here there is a cornucopia of prairie dogs. Why is it called the Devil's Tower? It's a unique structure. It's monolithic. To this day, nobody really knows for sure how it was formed, either igneous rock or a volcano. And we were determined to go to the Badlands National Park in South Dakota. However, the entrance to it is via the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And we got lost for hours and hours. And why did we get lost? Because there were no proper roads, as you can see here, but also no road signs. So we didn't know which way to go. Finally, we found the only food store in that area, and the owner tried to direct us. Who lives there? The Oglala Sioux Indians. That's probably the poorest settlement in the United States of America. It is obscenely poor. Broken homes, broken cars. I don't know how people live there. Yes, and here we are on the surface of the moon. And believe me, that's exactly how it looks when you approach it. The Badlands National Park. We thought we had landed on the surface of the moon. And here is a fossil of Tyrannosaurus rex. All that area is full of fossilized dinosaurs. Custer State Park, South Dakota, memorable place. when we entered the park, there was a sign saying, "Do not approach the bison." 100 people had been gored to death. They died. They were killed by the bison. And I don't want to tell the stories as to what happened to the bison, how they almost became extinct. The white people moved to the west and they murdered the bison in the most cruel way. And now Americans are trying to re-establish the bison, to bring them back to life. My husband was determined to see the bison. So here we are. That's a picture of the bison. We crossed the entire area and I was screaming the whole time. I was really scared. But there is something else very important about this Castor State Park. There was a very important battle here between the American Legion and the Oglala Sioux Indians. And General Castor was killed here. Crazy Horse was the leader of the Indians here. This is a very interesting area. My book describes in detail the various portions of the state park. We went to Denver, Colorado. We were about to take the airplane back home. However, before that, we went to the Natural History Museum in Denver. And this is a unique museum. Why? It has the largest collection of fossilized dinosaurs. I've never seen anything like it. They say about 70% of what you see there are real fossils. But something else attracted my attention, and this was an exhibition of figurines made of semi-precious minerals from the Ural Mountains. And it was the only one in the world outside Russia, I believe. And why was I so in love with these figurines? Because they reminded me of the stone flower, my childhood favorite story. What was special about it? The main character isolated himself for 28 or 30 years because he believed he needed isolation to produce something beautiful, perfectly beautiful. And I truly believe the same thing. I have to isolate myself in order to produce some good work. I finally live among Americans after a long period of living in upstate New York, and then I also lived in Washington, D.C. I moved with my job to various parts of the United States. And why do I say that I start living among Americans? These were small towns, relatively small towns, where communities were still traditional. They were determined to preserve the past, the history. They were very proud of who they were. And they were stepping into the future not by throwing away the past, but by holding on to it. Family, community were important to them. Rome, New York, nobody really knows. Even Americans don't know about Rome, New York. Clinton actually closed the Air Force Base, the Griffith Air Force Base, but it was still there when I worked there. And a B-52 Mohawk Valley is housed there to this day. Also, Rome, New York was a test of endurance. It's one of the coldest areas of the United States. But why am I saying that it's American? It was established by Italians over 100 years ago. And these people were determined to preserve their traditions also intertwined with the American traditions, and people were warm. I was told when I lived there that Rome, New York was the only place in the United States where there were no anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. Lexington, Kentucky, it's beautiful. This is a picture of a tapestry at William T. Young Library University. And it covers a wall on 5 floors. It was woven in Sweden, and it really represents Kentucky. Green pastures, peace, horses. It's the most famous equestrian center in the world. It breeds horses, and Queen Elizabeth II comes there every summer for the races. But there is something else about Kentucky. It's green. It's so beautiful, so peaceful. You just want to put down the suitcase and establish a home. Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville, Alabama is where NASA started. In 1945, the American government brought there a team of German rocket scientists with von Braun as their leader, and they developed NASA, among other things. There is something else. Huntsville, Alabama is truly a high-tech town. It has very, very advanced technology. It's a remarkable place. So what are these 2 pictures? The left picture is the view from my window. I looked at our visitors. And who are our visitors? Herons, foxes, eagles, and lots of snakes, of many types. On the right is a swamp, which I used to pass every morning at 6 o'clock when I walked all around the lake. And here, I'm still in Huntsville, Alabama. And something remarkable happened here. I participated in a meeting. Alabamians were against core competency, which is an education system that was imposed by the federal government in Washington, D.C. I made a comment. People liked my comment, and they asked me to represent them at state level. And there, I made a presentation, or rather I had a presentation, and I mentioned a book by Jack Finney called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And what is Invasion of the Body Snatcher? It's about cocoons coming from outer space and replacing the humans in a small town in California. So although they behave exactly like the human beings, the way they talk, the intonation, the way they look, the humanity, the emotions, the feelings are not there. They don't, you can't see in their eyes. And today, I'm thinking of the social media, the apps, that slowly turn us into invasion of the body snatchers. So what is home? Home is a community that welcomes people like me. I tried very hard to be part of every community where I lived, and I felt at home in places like Huntsville, Alabama, Lexington, Kentucky, Rome, New York, but I had roots everywhere else also. And here, right at the end, what is home? Home is not just a town, it can be the bosom of nature. I would like to reproduce a verse by George Gordon Byron, There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes, by the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man the less, but nature more. From these our interviews in which I steal, from all I may be or have been before, to mingle with the universe and feel what I can never express, yet cannot all conceal. And here I translated this also in Romanian and in Hebrew because I really love this verse. And it's me. That's where my home is. And that's it. And thank you so much.
Really amazing your presentation and your book also. I give the microphone to Adina to tell some words. To finish, to close our evening.
הרגשתי צורך לומר מילים אחדות על מחברת הספר שהוצג בפניכם הערב. מחברת הספר היא חברת ילדותי היקרה, שהיא כמו אחות בשבילי, ושמה בריג'יט, דוקטור בריג'יט בטט לבית אברמוביץ'. אני מלאת התרגשות וגאווה על כך שיש לי הכבוד להיות חברתה, להכיר את מעלותיה הרבות כבן אדם, כחברה, כאישה, נעימת הליכות וצנועה ובעלת אינטלקט גבוה, ואני רוצה לקוות שהיא מודעת לכל מעלותיה האלה. התרשמתי עמוקות מספרה הנוכחי בכללותו, אני לא קראתי את כולו, אבל התרכזתי במיוחד בסקירה של הפרק על חייה ברומניה, בצד הוריה והחברים שלה והיחסים ביניהם. היא כותבת באופן מקורי, בשפה גבוהה, עשירה, ויחד עם זאת קליטה, גם עבור אלה שלא שולטים טוב מאוד באנגלית. עשה עליי רושם רב באופן שבו דיברה על הוריה ועל סגולותיהם ועל היחסים ביניהם. ואגב, הוריה היו חברי נפש של ההורים שלי, היו גם שושבינים בחתונה של ההורים שלה. אביה, ינקו אברמוביץ', בפי חברים מיקי, היה עיתונאי מוערך, כפי שהיא אמרה, ואימה, אתל אדלינה, אישה חכמה, בעלת השכלה נרחבת. שניהם הטביעו בה אהבה לאות הכתובה, אהבה לקריאה וגם לכתיבה, וזאת בלי להפריע או ללא כל קשר לנטייה שלה לתחום המדעים, נטייה שגרמה לה לבחור בלימודי כימיה ופיזיקה. אני שמחה שפגישתה של בריג'יט והיכרותה עם גברת קליאופטרה בנובמבר 21 בהשקת ספר שלי פה במכון, והרושם הטוב שעשו זו על זו הביאה בעקבותיהן את ההזמנה להשיק את ספרה הערב פה במכון, ואני מקווה שכולכם נהניתם.
Mulțumim, dragă Brigitte.
I describe in the book.
Yes.
Care perioadă se numește
Thanks
așa?
for your participation. See you soon.
Nu, care